Black Moses. Despite the cultural awareness of Henry Gamache and Black Herman, hoodoo was not directly political. Most conjure and root work focused on regaining lost lovers, fixing troublesome neighbors, avoiding trouble with the law, overcoming unfair bosses, gambling on the right numbers, all practical concerns for men and women taking on life day by day. But a voice was rising on the American scene that combined mystical beliefs and political purpose in a wholly new way. It belonged to the black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. Garvey, who had sojourned from Jamaica to America in 1916, envisioned the creation of a Pan-African superpower that would take its place among the empires of the world. For a time, he came closer than many would have imagined possible, attracting tens of thousands of cheering followers to rallies and parades in America, England, and the Caribbean, creating a publishing empire of black newspapers and assembling the first and largest international black political organization in history. Followers wept openly at Garvey's rallies, as the uniformed orator extolled the dignity of black heritage and told of the history and destiny of Africa on the world stage. For many listeners who were old enough to remember slavery, and for others who lived in its shadow, hearing Garvey felt like a spiritual awakening. An FBI report in August 1920 observed of Garvey's movement that, among the followers, it is like a religion. Its leader, looked upon as a black Moses. In a pillar of Garvey's program often missed by those who scrutinized him, Garvey, like the social radical Wallace D. Wattles, believed that New Thought metaphysics could build the dreams of disenfranchised men and women around the world. Garvey's movement represented the boldest and least understood effort in history to combine the magic of mind power with the quest for political gain. Born in the North Jamaican seaside town of St. Anne's Bay in 1887, Garvey experienced a childhood that verged on brutality. His father was a stonemason and sometime gravedigger who had been born a slave. The elder Marcus, after whom his son was named, Garvey's mother had wanted to call him Moses, passed on to his children a tough-as-nails view of the world and a demand for the strictest respect. The older Garvey determined to teach Marcus about the rigors of life and the need for absolute self-reliance. One night Garvey took his son with him to dig a grave, for which the mason had fashioned a headstone. The father told the boy to drop into the grave, and he then snatched up the ladder behind him, leaving Marcus to shiver and cry in the hole all night. It was a torment he never forgot. Under the island's colonial education system, Marcus was forced to leave school at age 14. Around the same time, a neighboring white Methodist minister abruptly cut off a childhood friendship his daughter had maintained with Marcus. "It was then," Garvey wrote, "that I found out for the first time that there was some difference in humanity, and that there were different races, each having its own separate and distinct social life." The heavy-set bulldog-like teen was apprenticed to a printer, and a burgeoning interest in journalism was born. In 1910, Garvey traveled through Central America, where he was appalled to witness the second-class status occupied by black laborers completing the Panama Canal. Where was the black man's country? Garvey wondered, watching blacks labor for meager wages on the projects of other nations and colonial powers. A few years later he read educator Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, and the book's philosophy of self-sufficiency hit Garvey with the force of a religious conversion. Garvey took these ideas, merged them with his own form of radical opposition to white authority, and in 1914 transformed them into the platform of his Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. Eventually claiming 750,000 members, UNIA generated a surge of pride among members with its plans to create a shipping empire and a restored Pan-African nation, with Marcus Garvey as its uniformed imperial president. "Always think yourself a perfect being," Garvey told followers, "and be satisfied with yourself." His philosophy of faith in self and perpetual self-improvement formed Garvey's deepest appeal. And, to careful observers, it was firmly rooted in the grand tradition of American metaphysics. What was deemed a new racial philosophy, wrote historians Robert A. Hill and Barbara Baer in their Marcus Garvey Life and Lessons, was in fact Garvey's wholesale application of the dynamics of New Thought to the black condition. Metaphysics and politics were explicitly linked in Garvey's mind. UNIA newspapers and pamphlets abounded with telltale phrases of the New Thought movement, such as the call for a universal business consciousness in Garvey's Negro World newspaper. Garvey's Negro Factories Corporation advertised shares of stock by declaring, "Enthusiasm is one of the big keys to success," and a front-page headline in Garvey's Black Man newspaper announced, "Let us give off success and it will come," adding the indispensable New Thought maxim, "As man thinks, so is he." One of the only books that Garvey publicly recommended to followers was Elbert Hubbard's Scrapbook, a collection of life lessons by Hubbard, the social reform journalist admired by Wallace D. Wattles and hero of motivational thinking within New Thought circles. Garvey's favorite poet was Ella Wheeler Wilcox, the poet laureate of Mind Power, whose lines he used to conclude a 1915 UNIA rally. "Live for something, have a purpose, and that purpose keep in view, drifting like a helmless vessel, thou canst ne'er to self be true." While figures like Wallace D. Wattles and Marcus Garvey occupied two completely different worlds, they nonetheless shared a critical trait that alternately retreated and surfaced throughout each man's career. Their social radicalism rested on a metaphysical component, shrewdly couched in language to which every American, black or white, could instantly relate. A scientific understanding of God. Garvey made little direct reference to the source of his ideas. A degree of secrecy and confidentiality characterized almost all of Garvey's affairs, notes historian Hill, including those of the mind. In a speech he delivered in January 1928 in Kingston, Jamaica, however, Garvey's New Thought ideas were outlined perhaps more clearly than at any other time in his career. "Get yourself, as the white man has done, a scientific understanding of God and religion," he told his listeners, continuing, "What marks the great deal of difference between the Negro and the white man is that the Negro does not understand God and his religion. God places you here in the world on your responsibility as men and women to take out of the world and to make out of the world what you want in keeping with the laws of the Spirit. God has laid down two codes that man cannot afford to disobey, the code of nature and the code of the Spirit. The code of nature, when you violate it, makes you angry, makes you unhappy, makes you miserable, makes you sick, makes you die prematurely. Every sickness and every disease, I repeat, is a direct violation of the code of God in nature." Making a definite spiritual use of the term science, Garvey told the audience that whites live by science. You do everything by emotion. That makes the vast difference between the two races. Get a scientific knowledge of religion, of God, of what you are, and you will create a better world for yourselves. Negroes, the world is to your making. Contemporary readers of Garvey's words could easily miss, or simply wonder at, the political leader's references to religion and science. but the signposts abounded in Garvey's day. The mental healer Phineas P. Quimby had made a direct link between religion and science. Quimby believed that religion was, above all, a lawful phenomenon guaranteed to produce certain results. In his writings, which appeared to the public for the first time a few years before Garvey's address, the metaphysical healer used phrases like science of Christ, science of health and happiness, and, most tellingly, Christian Science. Garvey's spiritual science also had roots, occult roots, in his Caribbean boyhood. In the West Indies, the term science sometimes connoted magical practices. Writer-activist C.L.R. James, in his 1936 novel of Trinidadian domestic life, Minty Alley, showed how science and magic got tangled up when an older man confronted a younger neighbor. "These books you always reading." He picked up one and looked at the title. "About science? Ah, you read about science. Then you have books by de Lawrence?" This de Lawrence was an American writer on magic and psychic science, whose books had some vogue in the islands. "No," said Haynes, "it isn't that sort of science." "A man with your intelligence, if you read books on science, you would do well. See now, about 2 o'clock all the spirits of the air passing up and down, and if you know what to do, you can compel them and make them do what you like." The writer de Lawrence was a real person, a Chicago-based mail-order retailer of occult supplies, who was especially popular among Caribbean, African, and African-American consumers. A handsome, angular man who liked to be photographed wearing a turban over his blondish hair, L.W. de Lawrence was not above sometimes affixing his name to occult volumes that others had written. He was not quite a plagiarist. Rather, he was a book pirate, freely pilfering the work of others in an age of flimsy copyrights, much like English occultist Francis Barrett did in 1801 when he swiped large swathes of Agrippa's occult philosophy. In a karmic cycle of occult borrowing, de Lawrence lifted Barrett's ghoulish illustrations of evil spirits for reuse in his massive Great Book of Magical Art, Hindu Magic and Indian Occultism. Though white, de Lawrence specifically targeted Afro-Caribbean buyers. His overseas customers, who abounded in Garvey's Jamaica, may have found a kind of magical appeal in the fact that de Lawrence peddled his wares from the Institute of Hypnotism and Occult Philosophy in the heartland of America, a nation that still had the majestic sheen of promise and progress. Almost single-handedly, de Lawrence introduced the texts and formulas of American hoodoo to the Caribbean islands. Indeed, de Lawrence's scientific American-made formulas, with names typical in hoodoo catalogs like compelling powder, destruction powder, and oil of turnback, often displaced indigenous forms of herb magic in Jamaica's cities. Fearing de Lawrence's influence as a foreign agent of black magic, the nation's legal authorities banned his books. Even when the populist government of Michael Manley in 1972 slashed away at the list of officially censored publications, the magical works of L.W. de Lawrence remained illegal. So suspect was de Lawrence that any of his titles relating to divination, magic, occultism, supernatural arts, or other esoteric subjects formed the last vestiges of the Jamaican government's blacklist, alongside a few subversive tracts like Che Guevara's Guerrilla Warfare. Circle 7 Quran. The magical uses of science were not limited to the West Indies or Garvey. Indeed, the man who styled himself as Garvey's American successor used a philosophy of mystical science to form the basis for one of the most beguiling and influential inner-city religious movements of the 20th century, the Moorish Science Temple. Founded in Newark, New Jersey in 1913 and moved to Chicago in the early 1920s, the movement was led by a mysterious North Carolinian named Timothy Drew, known to followers as Noble Drew Ali. In a handful of grainy photographs, Ali appears as a slender man with a thin mustache, outfitted in an oriental silk robe and Masonic sash, alternately wearing a turban or tasseled fez, with his right hand crossed to his chest Napoleon fashion. He told followers that he was born black in 1886, but raised among the Cherokee Indian tribes. His ceremonial title of noble and other aspects of his regalia were very likely taken from Freemasonry's ancient Arabic order, Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, the order better known as the Shriners. In the late 19th century, the Masonic group had introduced America to the imagery, if not the actual ideas, of Islam. Some of the New York businessmen who founded the Shriners Lodge in 1877 did, in fact, take a serious interest in the philosophies of the East. Members even claimed a spurious connection with the Bektashi Sufi order, a legendary Turkish brotherhood of mystical Muslims known for wine-drinking and ecstatic worship. But by the early 20th century, the Shriners operated chiefly as a philanthropic guild, responsible for developing a remarkable network of free children's hospitals. The group's Byzantine symbols, including the fez, star and crescent, and scimitar, were relegated mostly to pageantry and decoration. While Noble Drew Ali often invoked Allah and Islam, or Islamism as he sometimes called it, he had almost no ties or traffic with the actual faith of Muhammad. Rather, Moorish Science was an American inner-city mystery religion built upon New Thought, Masonry, Theosophy, and occultism. Noble Drew Ali's marriage of Garveyite themes to esoteric rites and symbols helped respond to the yearnings for economic, cultural, and political power being felt in the cities to which the descendants of slaves had begun migrating. Elusive as his background was, the prophet of Moorish Science was rumored to have toured America as a magician in a traveling circus. A remarkable crumbling flyer discovered by writer Prince A. Cuba and reproduced by Peter Lamburn Wilson in his extraordinary book on apostate Islam, Sacred Drift, depicts a Noble Drew Ali close in spirit to the miracle-working Black Herman. The prophet Noble Drew Ali, announces the 1927 advertising sheet, will be bound with several yards of rope, as Jesus was bound in the temple at Jerusalem. The flyer goes on to promise that Noble Drew Ali practices the same art after being bound by anyone in the audience, and will escape in a few seconds. Here again was an emancipator in the mold of a scriptural hero, now Jesus himself. But the true magical key to Ali's science was his ultra-secret Circle 7 Quran, which members were sworn to keep hidden from outsiders. So serious was this oath that, even long after Ali's death in 1929, the sociologist Arthur Huff Fawcett, in his groundbreaking 1944 study, Black Gods of the Metropolis, would quote only from its front and back covers. The Holy Quran of the Moorish Science Temple of America. Know yourself and your Father, God Allah, that you may learn to love instead of hate. Every man need to worship under his own vine and fig tree, the unity of Asia. The cover featured the numeral 7, a reflection of Ali's penchant for occult and numerological symbols. The front and back encapsulated Noble Drew Ali's philosophy, that all people mistakenly labeled black, Negro, or colored were in fact Asiatic, or Moorish Americans whose natural form of worship was found in a monotheistic mystical Eastern faith that he called Islam. To Noble Drew Ali, Islam meant an unspoiled esoteric religion that extolled the holiness of Confucius, Jesus, Buddha, Zoroaster, and Noble Drew Ali himself. Jesus in particular, Fawcett noted, figures prominently in his secretive text, a fact that may have helped Moorish Science appear reassuringly familiar to Southern migrants raised within the Baptist Church. It was not until many years later that outsiders finally detected the actual contents of the long-concealed holy book. Its 48 chapters, packed into 64 tightly set pages, contained a dramatic narrative of the lost years of Jesus. It depicted the young carpenter as a great seeker of wisdom, traversing Tibet, India, and Egypt in search of self-knowledge and universal truth. The portrait of Jesus as a master adept or a great initiate occurred frequently in occult and mystical literature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And in this instance, the depiction was one that noble Drew Ali lifted nearly word for word from sections of a 1908 work that would go on to become a New Age classic. It was The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ by Levi. Actually, Levi H. Dowling, of Ohio, a former Civil War chaplain, homeopathic healer, publisher of Sunday school materials, and Progressive Church of Christ pastor. Dowling, the messenger, psychically received his epic of Jesus' lost years through contact with the Akashic Records, an ethereal hall of records that figured prominently in modern occultism, and about which more will be heard. Dowling's Aquarian Gospel was, in its way, the most ambitious and endearing of all self-generated literature about the life of Christ. It had a moral heart and message of universality, in which all religions were part of a great wide table. In the hands of noble Drew Ali, it became repurposed and uncredited as the prime narrative of the so-called Circle 7 Quran. Portions of the Circle 7 Quran not copied from Dowling's amounted to lessons in good living, fundamentals of self-sufficiency and moral conduct that later resurfaced in Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam and other black nationalist groups. Many of these passages were borrowed from a peculiar ancient wisdom book published in 1925 through the San Jose, California-based Rosicrucian group, Ancient and Mystical Order Rosicrucius, or AMORC. The book was called Unto Thee I Grant. AMORC billed it as the secret teachings of Tibet, a land that assumed Oz-like proportions in the minds of early 20th century occultists. The Rosicrucian publishers ultimately credited the work to manuscripts written by Pharaoh Amenhotep IV around 1360 to 1350 BC, an association that must have attracted their fellow Egyptophile, noble Drew Ali. In actuality, Unto Thee I Grant was copied not from Pharaonic manuscripts, but from an 18th century English instructional guide to manners and morals. It first appeared in 1750 under the title The Economy of Human Life. The book of moral aphorisms had always been intended to provoke intrigue. Attributed by its English publishers to nameless sources, The Economy of Human Life was mystical in conceit. Translated from an Indian manuscript written by an ancient Brahmin, read its title page. But it was distinctly bourgeois and Anglican in tone and content, alternately rumored to be the work of Lord Chesterfield or an English bibliophile named Robert Dodsley. The book appeared in expanded versions over time, including from a Scottish press in 1785, which is one of the earliest editions in general circulation. The question of who wrote The Economy of Human Life and who added to it along the way provoked a literary debate in 19th century Britain, culminating in an ultimately inconclusive work of sleuthing in 1854 by one W. Cramp, in the adventurously titled journal Notes and Queries. As with the Levi passages, noble Drew Ali simply recast the Anglican text with a mystico-Eastern tinge. From the creatures of God let man learn wisdom, and apply to himself the instruction they give. The Economy of Human Life, 1785. From the secret of Allah let man learn wisdom, and apply to himself the instruction they give. Circle 7 Quran, 1927. Never one to be cut out of the action, the redoubtable L.W. de Lawrence produced his own version of this ancient piece of Eastern instruction under the title Infinite Wisdom. He advertised it inside the prominent African-American newspaper Chicago Defender. Such notices almost certainly would have caught the attention of de Lawrence's fellow Chicagoan, Noble Drew Ali. Astoundingly, this pseudo-Eastern British work of the mid-18th century, which later morphed into pseudo-Egyptian versions in the hands of AMORC and de Lawrence, became the moral template for Moorish Science and other urban religio-political sects that followed in its steps. Indeed, a veritable who's who of early Black Power figures joined or came in close contact with Moorish Science in the 1920s, including the elusive ideological architect of the Nation of Islam, Wallace D. Fard, the Nation of Islam's preeminent early leader, Elijah Muhammad, and the self-declared God incarnate and spiritual teacher called Father Divine. But before pounding a gavel of judgment on the matter, a pause is in order. It is too easy in the present day to cast terms like plagiarist in the direction of figures like L.W. de Lawrence or Noble Drew Ali. In fact, many surviving religious texts, stretching back to the unfathomable oral tradition, have been redacted, recast, rewritten, and co-opted. Ever since the great Egyptian god of learning, Thoth, was remade literally millennia later as the wing-footed Mercury of the Romans. The Caesars of Rome routinely adopted the gods and deities of those lands they conquered. Scholars observe that the Hebrews almost certainly drew upon the cultic ideas of the once powerful desert worshippers of Baal. The early Christians clearly adapted the winter solstice and sun-worshipping festivals of the polytheists they overcame. Religious ideas travel. It is only due to the nature of 21st century record-keeping that we sometimes get to see the trail. Contemporary religious innovators have no more or less innocence than those who went before them. Rather, it is only our understanding of how religions get made that has changed. Laws, it has been famously observed, are like sausages. One should never watch their creation. The same could be said of religions. Not even his publisher knows his identity. Marcus Garvey's influence inspired an unusual depth of emotion in followers, and reached people from vastly different walks of life. In the early 1920s, an erudite mathematician and cosmological philosopher, Robert T. Brown, fell under the Garvey spell. This same Marcus Garvey, wrote Brown in Garvey's Negro World newspaper in June 1922, divinely inspired, heaven-sent and God-directed, formed the UNIA, which is, with but one exception, the greatest spiritual force that has ever swayed the minds of men since the world began. To Brown, the one and only force greater than Garvey's organization was the religion of Jesus Christ. But this was no starry-eyed believer in the Garvey gospel. Brown was a figure worthy of an accolade too often given, but in his case, uniquely deserved. A man ahead of his time. He was among the nation's first black esoteric philosophers and a person whose life would touch and change the fortunes of people around him. Born in Texas in 1882, Brown attended the all-black Samuel Houston College and became a high school teacher. By his early 30s, he'd ventured to Harlem, where he befriended the influential bibliophile and Freemason Arthur A. Schomburg. The two collaborated on exhibitions of Afro-American books and cultural artifacts, and Brown became president of the Negro Library Association. For several years, he had been nurturing an interest in the colorblind philosophy of higher mathematics. Attracted by the Theosophical Society's commitment to universal brotherhood and religious diversity, Brown became a member in 1915. Regardless of his growing reputation, he felt embarrassingly compelled to conceal his background from publishers E.P. Dutton. When they issued his 1919 treatise, The Mystery of Space, the writer feared that no critic or editor would take seriously a black metaphysician. Schomburg, in a personal letter marked confidential, informed a colleague, "Brown doesn't want to be advertised. Not even his publisher knows his identity." Brown's book, An Inquiry into Hyperspace, Mathematical Theory, and Unseen Dimensions, would today be called New Science or Quantum Theory. In it, Brown posited that matter and space are products of the one truly limitless resource, the human mind. He surveyed ideas from Egyptian geometry to the thought of Kant to argue that mind is the ultimate reality. On March 14, 1920, New York Times critic Benjamin de Casseurs, in a sometimes irritatingly self-regarding review that probably failed to attract many readers to Brown's book, called it the greatest of all latter-day books on space, a work by a mathematician, a mystic, and a thinker, one who, endowed with a tremendous metaphysical imagination, never lets go any point of the threads of reality. The same Robert T. Brown would later earn the loving gratitude of his fellow inmates in a Japanese prison of war camp during World War II, when he used metaphysical visualization techniques similar to those preached by Garvey to keep them from starvation in a tropical prison. Brown worked as a purchasing agent for the U.S. Army in the Philippines. After Japan invaded in late 1941, Brown was rounded up with thousands of other Americans living in the islands and thrown into the infamous internment camps, first at Santo Tomas and later at Los Baños. Unspoken Japanese policy was to allow prisoners to slowly starve to death. While inmates were free to go about their daily business fairly unimpeded, they were given threadbare provisions and left to care for themselves on whatever they could barter, grow, or manage to purchase from the world outside. As the war dragged on, malnutrition and starvation set in. Similar to the withering physical decline of most prisoners, Brown dropped from a robust 212 to 120 pounds. For everyone, food became an obsession, and Brown sought to help fellow inmates with the one tool he had to offer: training in mind-power techniques and other esoteric Christian methods. "See the orange and taste it," taught Brown. "Feel its nutrients going into your body and making you stronger." He instructed internees to collect recipes wherever they could find them, and to concentrate on the individual ingredients, using their mind as a nourishing force. According to historian Christopher Paul Moore in his remarkable recovery of Brown's history in Fighting for America, Black Soldiers, the Unsung Heroes of World War II, the mystic philosopher became the unlikeliest of prison heroes. Of all the courses and lectures taught by the teachers among the internees, none seems to have had more impact on the camp's population than Brown's mind-power techniques. Brown's philosophy spread throughout the camp and may have actually helped defer or at least delay some of the intense psychological pain associated with malnutrition and starvation. The visualization technique became a camp phenomenon. In February 1945, Brown and more than 2,000 prisoners were liberated from Los Baños in a historic airborne raid. He returned home to the United States and was welcomed by New York's African-American Amsterdam News on August 11 as a famous mathematician, philosopher, and author, who had survived Japanese imprisonment for 3 years until he and his fellow prisoners were miraculously rescued by paratroopers. Aside from an allusion to Brown lecturing internees on Oriental philosophy and the newer physics, no mention was made of those miracles rendered by Brown himself in the jungle camp. Although Brown had briefly edited one of Garvey's newspapers, he was largely unknown in either the white or black press. But he remained a man on the move. In 1950, he and his wife, Cecilia, founded the Hermetic Society for World Service, a theosophical-influenced religious order claiming guidance by the same masters who had taught Blavatsky and Alcott. Brown died in 1978, but his Hermetic Society still has members in the United States and Latin America. It is headquartered in the Dominican Republic, where Brown had established a branch in 1970. Foremost in the order's founding statement, Brown called for the protection of America, designated as the Grail in which will manifest the great cosmic light, which is destined to illumine the whole world. Our beloved America, Brown wrote, is the future Holy Land, from which world enlightenment would arise. Until the very end, Robert T. Brown, a man born not 20 years after the end of slavery, a mystic whose cosmological work was quickly celebrated and just as quickly forgotten, was still defending his vision of America, a harsh, magical land filled with limitless hope. Chapter 7. The Return of the Secret Teachings. In this house I chanced to find a volume of the works of Cornelius Agrippa. I opened it with apathy. The theory which he attempts to demonstrate, and the wonderful facts which he relates, soon changed this feeling into enthusiasm. A new light seemed to dawn upon my mind, and, bounding with joy, I communicated my discovery. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. Reference librarians had gotten accustomed to the hulking young man with the penetrating eyes and unstylishly long hair. Each day he entered the cavernous reading room of the New York Public Library and requested books that few others did. Old works of esoteric lore, Hebrew Kabbalah, Hellenic mythology, Pythagorean mathematics, papyrus transcriptions, and the like. Day by day he sat silently, combing through curious volumes with clockwork precision. It was the mid-1920s, the era of big money, bootlegged gin, and the Charleston, pleasures for which the precocious 25-year-old cared little. Rather, the amateur scholar and sometime banking clerk was on a mission to save the ancient wisdom teachings from obscurity in a world that he believed was going ethically illiterate. He bore the stately name of Manly P. Hall, and though to many the young man laboring over ancient tomes might have seemed just one more eccentric who passed daily through the library's great doors, the book he was preparing would become one of the most unusual and accomplished studies of esoteric lore and literature in modern history. The Real Know-How. In the years following World War I, when Theosophy and New Thought had directed fresh attention to occult philosophy and secrets of the ages, a bevy of self-styled mystics and turbaned scholars produced thick works purporting to unlock hidden doctrines. Many were patchwork affairs, pieced together from Renaissance-era occult works, academic tracts on myth and symbol, and guides to folklore. The Chicago occult dealer L.W. de Lawrence produced one of the most popular in 1919, with his Great Book of Magical Art, Hindu Magic, and Indian Occultism. An amalgam of pirated prose, clipped and pasted images, and muddled, if sometimes earnest, attempts at distilling Eastern religious practice and myth. Mail-order ads tantalized readers with the real know-how of occult, spiritual, and mystic formulae, as went a typical notice for the Hoodoo House author Louis de Clermont. Amid these forgotten offerings stands one study that eluded the empty promises of the day, a virtuoso guide to ancient and occult philosophies whose range and depth surpassed the holdings of many respected libraries. It was called by a breathless title, an encyclopedic outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian symbolical philosophy, being an interpretation of the secret teachings concealed within the rituals, allegories, and mysteries of the ages, or, as it became more simply known, the secret teachings of all ages. Had it come from a retired classics professor or aged English antiquarian, the book might have been less surprising, though still impressive. But it came from no such source. The Secret Teachings of All Ages was privately published in 1928 by the self-taught spiritual scholar Manly P. Hall, when he was 27 years old. From the start, the Secret Teachings was almost impossible to classify. Written and compiled on an Alexandrian scale, its hundreds of entries shone a rare light on some of the most fascinating and little understood aspects of myth, religion, cosmology, and philosophy. Its breadth of subjects could astound: ancient mathematics, alchemical formulas, Hermetic doctrine, pagan rites, Hebrew number mysticism, the geometry of ancient Egypt, Native American myths, the uses of cryptograms, an analysis of the tarot, the symbols of Masonry and Rosicrucianism, the esotericism of the Shakespearean dramas. These were just a few of Hall's topics. Initially bound in tabletop-sized dimensions, the Secret Teachings featured myriad illustrations, charts, tables, and diagrams, with varying rows of text and inset type, making the volume as jarring to the eye as a page of Babylonian Talmud. For students and enthusiasts of the arcane, the book was like an answered prayer. It sold tens of thousands of copies, often for more than $100, all out of sight of mainstream critics and booksellers, making it one of the most popular underground works in American history. Hall's volume seemed the product of a whole lifetime, and a rare one at that. Yet his 27 years provided few clues to his virtuosity. He attended no university. His roots in rural Canada and the American West offered him little obvious exposure to higher learning. His youthful letters betrayed no special fluency with the complexities of the ancient world. His family tried to steer him into the more practical career of selling fire insurance, and one of his first forays into professional life was as a banking clerk. The outstanding event of which, he recalled, was witnessing a man depressed over investment losses take his life. Even a generation later, the question reasserts itself on nearly every page of the Secret Teachings. How did this large-framed young man with little traditional education produce the last century's most original and masterly book on the esoteric wisdom of antiquity? A Philosopher's Progress. During his life, Hall refused to discuss more than the most cursory aspects of his background. Although he wrote many thousands of articles, lectures, and pamphlets, and dozens of books, his sole published biographical record is a thin volume called Growing Up with Grandmother, a tribute to the woman he called Mrs. Arthur Whitney Palmer. Her name was Florence Palmer. Often written in hagiographic sing-song anecdotes, the pamphlet-sized work is notable for what it reveals about Hall's reticence to broach virtually any intimacy of his childhood. Born at the close of the Victorian era, he was a man marked by a period in which the details of private life were closely held. Hall was born in the rural city of Peterborough, Ontario, on March 18, 1901, to a father who was a dentist and a mother who was a chiropractor. Hall's parents had separated while his mother was still pregnant, and the infant soon came into the care of his maternal grandmother. When the boy was 2 years old, Florence Palmer brought him to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where they lived for several years. It could only have been a lonely existence. A sickly child, Hall saw little formal schooling and spent long hours reading voraciously on his own. His contact with other children was limited, but there was a spark of some indefinable brilliance in the youth, which his grandmother nurtured on trips to museums in Chicago and New York. For a time, the boy and his grandmother lived in a high-end Chicago hotel, Palmer House, which was owned by relatives. There, Hall was mostly in the company of grown-ups, including a traditionally garbed Hindu maître d'hôtel, who taught him adult etiquette. Later on, the bookish adolescent was enrolled briefly, to his almost certain relief, in a military school. Tragedy struck early. His grandmother died when he was 16. He traveled to California to be with his mother and came under the influence of a self-styled Rosicrucian community in Oceanside, California. He lived at the Rosicrucian Fellowship, where he formed close relationships, but also grew suspicious of the order's claims to ancient wisdom. Soon he moved on his own to Los Angeles, where he fell in with metaphysical seekers and discussion groups. In 1920, Hall began a precocious career in public speaking, giving an address on reincarnation in a small room above a Santa Monica bank. Word spread of the boy wonder's mastery of arcane and metaphysical subject matter. He began addressing a liberal evangelical congregation called the Church of the People, and quickly rose to the rank of minister. In 1923, the Los Angeles Times seemed positively smitten with the 22-year-old, covering his lectures and sermons in several articles. "He is tall," the Times reported on May 28, "with unusually broad shoulders, football shoulders, but he wears his curly, dark brown hair bobbed like a girl's, and even his face and eyes convey an almost feminine impression." In a practice that he would maintain for the rest of his life, the youth lectured from a wooden mission-style chair, enrapturing his listeners without physical movement or gesticulation. He promoted classical ethics as a balm for the torpor of contemporary life. "Let us remember also," the young idealist told congregants, "that our main problem with the criminal is to seek to adjust his motives and mode of thinking so that the same force and persistence which he uses to accomplish evil deeds will be turned to the accomplishment of worthy purposes. Our hard pavements and stool lunch counters have a tendency, by playing havoc with the nervous constitution of man, to produce thieves, libertines, and murderers." Hall had already begun attracting benefactors and traveling abroad in search of lost knowledge. Yet his early letters from Japan, Egypt, China, and India were, in many respects, ordinary. They contained little of the eye-opening detail or wonder of discovery that one finds in the writings of other early 20th century seekers encountering the East for the first time, such as legendary British soldier and writer T.E. Lawrence. Like a bolt from the blue, however, a short work of immense power emerged from the young Hall, a book that seemed to prefigure the greater work that would come. In 1922, Hall produced a brief, luminescent gem on the mystery schools of antiquity, Initiates of the Flame. With ease and gracefulness, Hall wrote across a spectrum of subjects, describing Egyptian rites, Arthurian myths, and the practices of alchemy, revealing the psychological underpinnings of arcane methods. "Man has been an alchemist from the time when first he raised himself," Hall wrote. "Experiences are the chemicals of life with which the philosopher experiments." The book inaugurated Hall's collaboration with illustrator J. Augustus Knapp, whose watercolor plates would later run throughout the Secret Teachings. For the rest of Hall's career, his friend Knapp's work elicited cheers and groans among readers. Knapp's paintings were fanciful, Disney-esque, minutely detailed imaginings of ancient events, both playful yet surprisingly subtle, like the work of an occult Norman Rockwell. A fitful idealist. Like many young artists, Hall felt himself a stranger to his times. He fretted over the jazz-age giddiness and the hunger for money that he saw first-hand in his brief career at a New York brokerage firm before the Great Depression. In addition to witnessing a distraught investor's suicide, he recalled an elderly bookkeeper who was discovered dead at his desk after nearly a half-century on the job. During a dangerous flu epidemic, Hall remembered, people trudged into work as though devotion to the business was the symbol of true character. The numbing influence Hall detected in high commerce was not all that disturbed him. He bemoaned the phony Mahatmas who had begun hanging out shingles in large American cities, turbaned figures like Chicago's DeLoreans who extolled Tibetan wisdom and Hindu magic, often without having ventured beyond American shores. Hall later wrote, "Self-appointed teachers arose without adequate backgrounds, knowledge, or credentials, and swept through the nation. Glamorous ladies in $1,000 evening gowns waving ostrich-plumed fans taught prosperity to the hungry poor at $25 a course. Mysterious swamis, yogis, and the like entranced audiences of from 2,000 to 4,000 at a meeting." Nor did he find succor in mainline religious scholarship, which, in his eyes, treated esoteric and primeval religions as museum pieces, not living philosophies with relevance for contemporary people. "With very few exceptions," Hall wrote, "modern authorities downgraded all systems of idealistic philosophy and the deeper aspects of comparative religion." Translations of classical authors could differ greatly, but in most cases the noblest thoughts were eliminated or denigrated, and scholarship was based largely upon the acceptance of a sterile materialism. Indeed, one of the period's most influential academic studies of myth and arcana, the Golden Bough, disparaged the meaning of its own subject matter. "In short, magic is a spurious system of natural law as well as a fallacious guide of conduct. It is a false science as well as an abortive art." Barren religious scholarships, fake gurus, worship of Mammon, wherever Hall looked, he was dismayed. The secret teachings of all ages took shape in his mind as a way to reestablish a vital living connection to the search for meaning that he believed characterized the academies of the ancient world. To signal how his approach differed from materialist scholarship, Hall quoted his philosophic hero Francis Bacon early in the massive work. "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion." The Great Book appears. Hall's world travels in the early 1920s gave him some degree of proximity to the monuments and philosophies of antiquity. But the materials that finally made it possible for him to complete his Book of Wisdom were those he discovered in the great Western libraries just opening to widespread public use. Through the influence of benefactors including General Sir Francis Younghusband, who led Britain's invasion of Tibet at the turn of the century, the budding scholar gained access to some of the rarest manuscripts at the British Museum. While living in New York in the mid-1920s, Hall found a resource to rival Britain's own: the vast Beaux-Arts reading room of the New York Public Library. Sitting at one of the huge oak tables that line the cathedral-sized space, Hall toiled over books of myth and symbol, just steps away from the Times Square razzmatazz that represented everything he chafed against. He amassed a bibliography of nearly 1,000 entries. The books he requested were always available, at once a reminder and byproduct of the general lack of interest in the topics he loved. By mid-1928, having pre-sold subscriptions for almost 1,000 copies and printing 1,200 more, Hall published what would become known as the Great Book, and it has never gone out of print since. While self-published and self-financed, and invisible to mainstream scholars, the book soared on the wings of enthusiastic reports from readers. Hall received a letter from the Crown Prince of Sweden praising the work. Freemasonic lodges everywhere bought copies, and to this day the book remains a standard in Masonic libraries. Its admirers ranged from General John J. Pershing, the ramrod-straight commander of the American forces in World War I, to, a generation later, Elvis Presley, who possessed his own signed copy. To enthusiasts of the Esot-Eric, the secret teachings solidified Hall's reputation as a scholar of mythic proportions, and it gave the young writer new clout in attracting benefactors. Hall collected enough money from his growing list of acolytes, including the wife of an L.A. oil tycoon and highly placed Freemasons — Hall joined Masonry himself in 1954 — to open an Art Deco faux Mayan campus in 1934 in the Griffith Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. Calling it the Philosophical Research Society, or PRS, Hall fancifully spoke of modeling his organization after the ancient mystery school of Pythagoras. More practically, PRS provided a cloistered setting where Hall spent the rest of his life teaching, writing, and assembling a remarkable collection of antique texts and devotional objects. His small campus eventually grew to include a 50,000-volume library with catwalks and floor-to-ceiling shelves, a 300-seat auditorium with a throne-like chair for the master teacher, a bookstore, a warehouse for the many titles he wrote and sold, a wood-paneled office complete with a walk-in vault for antiquities, and a sunny stucco courtyard. Designed in an unusual pastiche of Mayan, Egyptian, and Art Deco motifs, PRS became one of the most popular destinations for LA's spiritually curious, and remains so. After Hall's death on August 29, 1990, the idyllically self-contained campus barely survived simultaneous legal battles, one with Hall's widow, who claimed it owed her money, and another with an eccentric con artist who, in the estimation of a civil court judge, had befriended an ailing octogenarian Hall to pilfer his antiques and assets. Hall signed over his estate to this shadowy trustee just 6 days before his passing. As will shortly be seen, the timing and other circumstances rendered Hall's death sufficiently suspicious for Los Angeles police to label the case as open for several years after. The financial damage from these stormy years was irreversible. Following a protracted court battle in which a superior court judge nullified Hall's will and turned over control of PRS from his dubious beneficiary to a group of longtime supporters, the nonprofit organization faced a crushing $2 million legal debt. To survive, it was forced to sell off some of its most cherished items, including 234 alchemical, hermetic, and Rosicrucian manuscripts to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Other valuables, including 214 rare manuscripts that Hall had spent a lifetime amassing, were delivered as part of a settlement to his widow, who reportedly earmarked them for sale to a European collector. Its holdings permanently diminished, PRS regained fiscal health beginning in 1993 under a new president, Obadiah Harris, the man who had once been a protege to Science of Mind founder Ernest Holmes. Harris was now a religious scholar and respected university administrator. He took the job for no salary. Under Harris, PRS established a state-accredited distance learning university, which granted graduate degrees. The school fulfilled a goal that Hall had spoken of toward the end of his life. Through both good times and bad, PRS kept in print the sumptuous, oversized editions of Hall's great book. Beginning in 2001, PRS partnered with a trade publisher to create a newly designed reader's edition of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, a compact, textually unabridged version of Hall's original. This edition was published by the present author. Within a few years, the reader's edition had entered more than 16 printings, probably reaching more readers than The Secret Teachings had throughout its previous lifetime. More than a decade after his death, Hall had not only eluded the obscurity that time held in store for most of his contemporaries, but had become one of the few esoteric figures from the 20th century whose work grew in reach in the next. A Private World. Hall wrote scores of other books over the course of his life and composed literally thousands of pamphlets and articles. He is estimated to have delivered about 8,000 lectures, typically given without notes, recited with crystalline precision. Yet for all his output, Hall remained a riddle to those around him. Following his Sunday morning lectures at PRS, he would promptly exit the auditorium from a side door, enter a car, and be driven back to his nearby house. A first marriage in 1930 ended with his wife's suicide a little more than a decade later. He was into middle age in 1950 when he remarried to a petite German-American divorcee, Marie Bauer. His second bride harbored a deep interest in the occult and an all-consuming belief that a buried vault in Williamsburg, Virginia, contained the secret mystical manuscripts of her and Hall's hero, the philosopher Francis Bacon. Marie and her husband also considered Bacon the hidden genius behind the Shakespearean plays, a theory that Hall took considerable efforts to defend in his great book. Possessed of a mercurial temper and fierce determination, Marie Bauer was, in the eyes of some, a formidable equal to her imposing husband. To others she raised the question of Hall's choice of companions. Marie was known for sharp mood swings and a dictatorial manner toward friends and guests who would venture near her husband. 2 years after Hall's death, 2 acolytes of Marie's ideas were convicted of trespassing in Virginia's Bruton Parish churchyard, where they conducted an illegal dig for the mythical Bacon vault. Unlike his histrionic wife and the many spiritual teachers who flocked to Hollywood, Hall showed relatively little interest in attracting publicity or hobnobbing with movie stars. Later in Hall's life, his best-known friend was the folk singer and balladeer Burl Ives, famous for his rendition of Frosty the Snowman. Ives was also a fellow Freemason. Hall rarely involved himself in the movie business, though in 1938 he did contribute the story to a forgettable murder yarn with an astrological theme, When Were You Born? In a segment at the film's opening, a young Hall looks into the camera and explains to the audience the meaning of the zodiac signs. In those instances when Hall did succumb to Hollywood glitz, the results were more humorous than glamorous. In 1940, an entertainment columnist reported that Hall, famous Los Angeles student of occult sciences, hypnotized actor Bela Lugosi for a death scene in a low-budget Lugosi-Boris Karloff vehicle called Black Friday. Universal Pictures trumpeted Lugosi's portrayal of a man suffocating to death in a closet as the first scene ever filmed of a player under the influence of hypnotism. The movie trailer briefly showed an angular, mustached Hall sitting over Lugosi and waving his hands across the actor's face in the style of mesmeric passes found in the books of Andrew Jackson Davis. Entertainment pages reported that Lugosi, hypnotically convinced he was in mortal danger, wrecked the movie set in a desperate fight to escape. The affair gave rise to an urban legend that Hall had hypnotized Lugosi before his legendary performance as Dracula. Off the movie set, the Hungarian actor and Californian occultist became close friends. The 2 men bonded over their shared love for classical music, which they listened to together on phonograph records. In 1955, the 73-year-old Lugosi wed his 5th bride at Hall's Hollywood home. Newspaper photos showed an ashen-faced Lugosi, the very image of Martin Landau's portrayal years later in the movie Ed Wood, clinking champagne glasses with his 39-year-old bride, a cutting-room clerk who met the actor while he was being treated for drug addiction. When it came to friendship, celebrity glamour was no requisite for entering Hall's world. The Mystic in Decline. As an old man, Hall continued to sound much like he did as a young one. A year before his death, he fretted to a reporter that colleges produce financially and academically successful students, but not good persons. They don't teach honor and integrity. At times he could disappoint New Age-era acolytes with chestnuts like, "Old-fashioned common sense is one of the most uncommon things we have." After Hall's death, the Los Angeles Times offered an austere tribute. Followers say he believed in reincarnation and in a mixture of the Golden Rule and living in moderation. In this sense, the prodigious scholar had fashioned the study of occult ideas into a search for ethical living. If the point of all higher knowledge, as Hall saw it, was to refine and improve a person's life, his own existence would have to be judged a failure as often as a success. In his later years, Hall often slipped into a routine of doing that which he simply knew how to do, delivering another lecture, writing another book, and issuing another pamphlet. In an address at PRS in the closing years of his life, Hall sought to put forth a major statement on the social, political, and environmental threats facing America and the world. The physical frame and confident phrasing were still that of Hall, speaking extemporaneously for a long stretch, rarely shifting in his throne-like chair, and never losing a beat. Yet the content was tedium itself, filled with political bromides such as the need for environmental stewardship and the caretaking of democracy, points with which no sensible person could argue or fail to anticipate. In the late 1980s, Hall appeared to lose his personal judgment and his ethical compass. He turned over all of his household and business affairs, and even his and PRS's financial assets, to a self-professed shamanic healer and reincarnate of Atlantis, named Daniel Fritz. More prosaically, Fritz was known as a computer marketer, health products entrepreneur, and, in the eyes of Hall's friends and colleagues, a grifter. Colleagues say Hall disregarded, and in one case even fired, long-time employees and associates who questioned the relationship. Even a seasoned Superior Court judge found Fritz worthy of disdain. "Did Mr. Fritz effectively steal from Mr. Hall?" said Judge Harvey A. Schneider upon invalidating Hall's belatedly amended will. "I think the answer is clearly yes. The evidence is so overwhelming that Mr. Fritz exerted undue influence over Mr. Hall. The whole thing just doesn't pass any reasonable person's sniff test." Ill and dangerously overweight in his final years, Hall had apparently bought into Fritz's claims as a mystical healer and his Barnum-like promises to spread the aged scholar's work across the world. One friend observed that Fritz did help Hall drop his weight from 300 to 200 pounds through diet and exercise, and relieved his painful constipation with the help of colonics. But in a troubling move, the 89-year-old Hall signed his estate over to Fritz less than a week before he died. It is tempting to speculate that the aged Hall suffered from senility, yet he delivered a typically well-attended lecture just days before his death. It was a death that Hall's widow, Marie, stoked intense concerns over, telling the Los Angeles Times in 1994, "I firmly believe it was murder." She wasn't the only one. Investigators with the Los Angeles Police Department found the circumstances suspicious. Hall was alone with Fritz and Fritz's son when he died. Hours passed before the death was reported. The body appeared to have been moved from the outdoors to inside. And there was the strange timing of the new will. Charges were never pursued, and after Fritz's death from a rare form of cancer in 2001, and his son's death 2 years later from an autoimmune disorder linked to AIDS, the file was closed on Hall's death. The cause was listed as heart failure. Aged, obese, and suffering from a strained heart, Manly P. Hall was probably not the victim of foul play, as friends feared, but his final days were still puzzling. One longtime friend of Hall's wondered how someone like Fritz could so suddenly grow unduly influential over a man noted for his independence of thought and action. Hall's intimate companions, the shifty Fritz, the erratic Marie, the sometimes sycophantic staffers, all seemed to point to a man who proved a poor judge of where to place trust. The wisdom that Hall had cultivated his whole life appeared to abandon him when its fortification was most needed. As though prophesying his own decline, Hall wrote in the PRS Journal in 1986, "Noble thoughts out of context lost most of their protective meanings." For all his emphasis on the practicality of ancient wisdom, Hall's life, in some respects, was a case in point of a truth not found in his writings. A person can accumulate the wisdom of the ages, gleaning knowledge from the greatest books, lectures, and research, with none of it penetrating oneself. That perplexity of human nature, a puzzle at the heart of all ethical philosophies, seems never to have occurred to him. The enduring value of the secret teachings. Every writer, literary critic Irving Howe once noted, must be read and remembered for his best work. So it is with Manly P. Hall. The depth of Hall's early achievement remains undiminished, and throws an observer back to the question, how did a modest young man complete what can be considered a one-of-a-kind codex to the ancient occult and esoteric traditions of the world, all by age 27, with little traditional education? To read Hall's great book is to experience a readerly joy rarely associated with ordinary compendiums of intellectual or religious history. Its depth, breadth, and detail are, simply put, not ordinary, and not easily understood. In an obscure astrology magazine of the 1940s, an Indian journalist wrote a personal profile of Hall, which held an interesting, if somewhat fanciful, passage. The question is constantly asked on all sides as to how Mr. Hall can know and remember so much on so many different and difficult subjects. Perhaps a direct answer to this constant question may be discovered in the following episode in the life of Mr. Hall himself. The first question Mr. Claude Bragdon, American mystic — Bragdon was not a mystic, but rather an accomplished architect and publisher, who served as a prod and muse to many 20th-century metaphysical writers — asked Mr. Hall after their first meeting in New York in 1937 was, "Mr. Hall, how do you know so much more about the mathematics of Pythagoras than even the authorities on the subject?" Standing beside both these dear American friends of mine, I was wondering with trepidation in my heart what reply Mr. Hall would make. "Mr. Bragdon," answered Mr. Hall quickly, unhesitatingly, and with a simultaneous flash of smile in his eyes and on his lips, "you are an occult philosopher. You know that it is easier to know things than to know how one knows those things." To the question of how Hall achieved what he did, his most fervent admirers suggest that he was born with knowledge from other lifetimes. Others believe he had a photographic memory. In the end, perhaps one can only conclude such a question with still more questions. But the accomplishment of the secret teachings is finally this: it was the only serious, comprehensive codex of its era that took the world of myth and symbol on its own terms. Hall peered into sources that many historians refused to consider. From Masonic and Rosicrucian tracts to alchemical and astrological works, and recent scholarship has justified some of his historical conclusions. Up through the late 20th century, most classical scholars would have considered Hall's descriptions of oracular rites at Delphi as near fairy tale, with their portraits of soldiers and statesmen visiting an intoxicated trance medium seated on a tripod-like throne above a smoky crevice in a cave. Yet Hall's portrayal, based on esoteric source literature, has since been validated by early 21st century geological and archaeological finds at Delphi. Hall was not a writer who sifted through and repeated accounts that others had written. His chapters on Pythagorean mathematics displayed graceful ease over vast complexities, capturing the essence and splendor the ancient sage had discovered in the geometry of the natural world. Likewise, Hall catalogued and analyzed the complex symbols and ideas of alchemy, the arcane practice that formed the basis for modern chemistry. While the secret teachings of all ages has always been ignored within academia, it influenced some who chose more traditional scholarly paths than Hall's. The University of Chicago historian of ancient religion, Mircea Eliade, whose work brought new respect to the study of Gnostic and esoteric belief systems in the 20th century, confided to friends that as a young man it was Hall's book that awoke in him the love of myth and symbol. Hall was able to reach hungry young minds because he never lost his own sense of youthful idealism and wonder over the esoteric cultures he observed. He clarified ancient ideas that could otherwise seem beyond reach, writing not as a distant judge, but as a lover of the rites and mysteries embodied in the old ways.